Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out to my talk. Very nice to see all of you. I feel like we cut attendance by half from the party last night. So you guys are all troopers. So this talk is normally called Down the SVG Rabbit Hole. There's a lot of things that we go through. This is going to be what we're going to end up with. This is all inline SVGs. The only piece that is external on here is a CSS fill with a hex code value. It's one of my, it's one of the coolest things ever, and nobody uses it, and it blows my mind that nobody uses it. These were graphics from a project called Pro Gaming League. They're now called Millennial Esports. They service like online gaming companies. I'm not a gamer. Like Halo and League of Legends and all of that fun stuff. So for all the gaming nerds, we built these really fun animations for it. So I'm a former nuclear engineer turned front-end developer. I have a really crazy story to tell you about that. You can ask me later. I work on the international growth team with a company called Shopify. We are coming to Germany, so shameless plug, if any back-end devs are looking for e-commerce stuff, come and talk to me after, or one of the recruiters, Julia, she's here. She gave a talk yesterday. I also run a business called Zona Fitness Academy. It's an online e-learning platform for fitness trainers. I live in a tiny mountain town in the middle of nowhere called Revelstoke. It's about an 8-hour drive from Vancouver, but none of you know where that is, so I just say Vancouver. It's better. And I am a sports adrenaline junkie. And this was our pet bear that lived in our yard for about 7 days in a tree. Fun fact. Okay, so today we're going to be going, I'm just going to start at a baseline so that everybody here kind of has an understanding of where we're getting started with SVGs. How many of you use SVGs in production right now? How many of you have, like, you feel like you understand each of the attributes that are in an SVG element? Okay, so this is why we started at a baseline. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about the bones of our SVG and just talk a little bit about collaborating with designers so that you can make this less painful, because this process can be generally quite painful for developers if they're not working with a designer that really understands what they're doing and exporting stuff from Sketch or Illustrator. I'm going to talk a little bit about my Fed SVG workflow, and then we're going to get into the guts of the actual talk, which is the super cool SVG animations that you saw at the beginning. So when you're working with a design team, you want to make sure that at the beginning of the project you determine what your goals are actually going to be. So if you want stagnant or animated SVGs, because this will totally change your Fed workflow, and it'll change the amount of time that you want your designers spending in their sketch files. So for this reason, you want to communicate really early on in the projects what your primary goals are going to be. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about exporting from Sketch, just so that we have a baseline of that. So when you guys go back to your design team, you're like, hey, you're doing this wrong, so you should probably do it the right way. Make my life a little bit easier. I am not going to be talking about exporting from Illustrator because there's a lot of really awesome online tutorials, and they're great resources for that. I am, however, going to talk about what it looks like when a designer will send you an SVG in Sketch. So I realize this is Illustrator, this is a screenshot of Illustrator, but I wanted to kind of just elaborate on the point. That is a really ugly piece of code. This is by default what it looks like from your designer. It's totally unnecessary, okay? All of those nested files, so for every single layer that goes in here, this is exactly what the default export's gonna be when you come out of Sketch. So there is this great command line that you can put in and restart your computer for your design team, and it will take out a large portion of those ugly guts that you just saw. You can write that down, but the slides are tweeted out, so if you want that, you can take a look at it. There's a company out of New York called Thoughtbot. This is what they use for all of it, but it essentially just creates a compact form of the SVG. It's a little bit nicer. So let's talk about exporting SVGs from Sketch. So within Sketch, we have this infinite canvas. And so what happens is the SVG element itself will have transforms and translates attributes attached to the actual SVG. And so for that reason, doing really advanced effects can be difficult because you also have to take into account the already existing transforms and translate. So if you have this infinite canvas and you have this like small SVG on one specific point within that canvas, that generally is not very helpful. And so what you want to be doing is actually creating your own artboard for the SVG itself. Then you're going to take and select the layers within the panel. From there, you're going to take and flatten everything. Flattening just takes and merges the pathways that you saw. So each of these small elements on here will have specific paths or an extra element indented into the SVG. And so what we want to do is make sure that when we're using the fill on it, that it's all within one single element. And so doing that process takes what you saw on the left to what you saw on the right. And that's a pretty nice piece of code to work with. It's kind of more readable HTML. You know, I like it. It's easier. And so this SVG is literally just the close element. So like, imagine that X that you have on every single modal, every single like form element, whatever you want to call it. That's a really simple icon. It shouldn't be that complex. And so what happens is now we have one folder with two elements. So we have two paths, which are respectively each side of the X. So I'm going to skip that. So let's talk a little bit about SVGs for beginners. Generally, this is how the SVGs are defined. You have something called a grouping. You have your IDs, your strokes. And so for every single group or G element within an SVG, that is a folder, respective to Illustrator or Sketch. And so we want to remove a lot of that nesting. The other thing that you'll see in here, which is like kind of messy, is this transform and translate piece that I had talked about previously. This is literally Sketch taking and moving that element where it is within the infinite canvas on the page. And we don't really want that because that adds a lot of variable or variations when we're taking and doing a lot of these crazy animations. And then you have each of your actual elements or pathways. Now, these numbers and letters, they all mean something. I'm totally happy to have a discussion about what they mean, but it's kind of just how the browser will read the elements. So what we want to end up with is a really succinct form of the SVG. So we have the view box, which is essentially the artboard of the element. So wherever the element lives on that actual page. So imagine you have a canvas that's 33 by 33. And the starting point is at 0, 0, which is the top left-hand corner. And from there, it goes across the canvas. And so by definition, we have a grouping tag, which is the folder that contains everything, and then we have two pathways. So this first pathway is that first cross of the stroke, and the second pathway is the second cross of the stroke, and that's it. That's like a simple X icon. This is literally just so that you guys have a baseline to understand like how our SVGs set up. So let's talk a little bit about SVG optimization. So there's this awesome tool called SVGO. I'm sure that most of you use it. If you're doing crazy animations, I wouldn't really recommend it. They have done a significant amount of work. I'll explain. So unless you took the time to go through all those steps that I talked about within Sketch, SVGO actually will prevent you from being able to modify the SVG in the way that you need to later on. So you can use SVGO and do these animations and effects later on, but you want to make sure that it's within its own artboard or within its own canvas, because otherwise you have these transforms and translates attributes attached to the SVG pathways or to the SVG elements, and this will cause a discrepancy within the animations, and it will actually prevent you from having it accessed on multiple browsers. So again, beware of SVGO. It's good for like icons and like if you're doing really simple stuff, but if you're doing more complex animations, I still, to this day, will edit SVGs in Sublime or like in your text editor, because otherwise there's too many variations and you have to start back at the beginning. This is another fun little snippet of code that I love. So generally as a front-end developer, you'll define a lot of your baselines. Just like you would with the image, iframe, and video element, you also want to add SVG to the max width 100% as your defaults. And the reason why you want to do this is because you don't want the SVG to be exploded outside of its parent container. This is just one of those things that I always add to my base files. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some like cool how-tos that you can actually have. So the beautiful thing about SVGs is you can define it once within the DOM, and you can utilize it across the entire project. Okay, so imagine you have social icons or you have logos. This is like a very standard example of how you can use SVGs. And so we had a project not that long ago where we had social icons defined in the footer, we had social icons defined in our profiles, and then we had multiple versions of our logo depending on where it was. And so each of those items are only defined once on the page. And so you have that pathway of letters and numbers that defines the actual shape of the element. Yeah, so you can utilize this awesome element called use within your SVG, where you define the pathway once and you can target which element or icons you want to utilize with an ID and the use tag. And so that allows you to define the SVG once and use it everywhere. And so what ends up happening is you have a really long piece of text or like a really long piece of like SVG code that will allow you to take and target each of those items. So in this case, like, you can see in the top left-hand corner the little like lightning bolt icon. But you can see that it's used in like quite a few places. And so what happens is I have that pathway defined once, and I can take it, target it just by calling an xlink href. And so that correlates to an ID that's attached to the pathway or the group within the SVG. And you can use both. Then you can take and add a fill color. You can add like width and height attributes if you want. The same thing goes with how I'm utilizing all of these SVG badges, or like these skull badges that you see across the entire site. And the other way to do this as well is with a lot of these like social icons, which is also a pretty standard piece. So I'm gonna take and see if I can find this lovely piece of code so I can show you a React project that we did not too long ago. Okay, so can you guys read that okay, or do you want me to increase the font size? Okay, so in this file, we're defining a component called social icons. You can see within here we have like the angel list icon, we have a Twitter icon with a grouping, and we have a social Facebook icon, dribble, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so these pathways are only defined once on the actual page within the DOM. And so I pull that into the footer and I can take and target it throughout the entire project on any given page. So what happens if I give it a width and a height of 0, and it sits, it like lives on within the DOM, but you don't actually see it unless you call it with those pieces of code using the use element. So I can take and target it the same way, where it'd be like social-Twitter or social-Facebook, and these are one of the ways that you can take and actually reduce the amount of code that you have within the page. And so that's just one of the fun ways that you can utilize SVGs. So let's get into the like actual guts of the talk, the like fun stuff. I don't know about any of you. I am like a super math nerd, so there are matrices in here, there's cubic Bezier functions, there's standard deviations. It's awesome. So some of these filters, and one of the cool things that you won't actually know on this is the exact same SVG element, and the only thing that I'm applying that's different on here is I'm either adding a fill color or I am not applying a fill color at all. So by default, SVGs are black within the DOM. If you don't apply a fill color of any kind, you're gonna get that. And so the reason why this, like you can see on the top right too, the The reason why they're white is because I'm applying a white light effect to the SVG element itself. And there's no 3D effects, but it's literally the exact same piece of SVG code or pathway that's defined once. And then you can just take and apply these effects each way. So if you want to jump into CodePen, there is a CodePen, so you can take and play around with any of these. There's 2 versions of each of them. There's one with GSAP that uses it, and then there's one that utilizes the inline animate, FEGO and blur, like all of the inline SVG elements that you can use for these elements. So this is the baseline, okay? So we have a class set. We're applying an inline style with a fill color. You can do this within the CSS as well. We're defining the view box, which is really important. So on here, you'll see some of the effects that are created where the view box needs to actually be a little bit bigger because of the glow effect that you have. Otherwise, you'll hit the corners of the box, and you don't want that to happen. And then what's happening is I'm targeting that really, really large SVG pathway. I'll show it to you after if we have time. So the same way that you would take and define your definitions within the SVG, you would also take and apply the filter element within that inline. So we're going to go into detail a little bit for this. And so this particular SVG doesn't have a fill color on it, okay? It is by default no fill. There's no style applied to it at all. It's just this code that's in here. And so what you can see within this is we have a filter where we're defining the spotlight. So the reason why I want to do that is because I want to take and utilize the use, or like the filter element that you need to apply to the SVG itself. So what happens in here is you take and define the ID, and you give it a name with the filter effects that you can take and apply it across. And so in here you take a ghost and blur. And so I'm taking the original element, and I'm calling the result of the original source graphic after you take and apply this effect. So I'm going to take and create a blur effect with a standard deviation of 2. Okay. From there, I give it a result and call it blur 1. Then I take that initial blur 1 and I put it within the new lighting effect that I want to apply as well. And so I'm creating a specular exponent light. So the specular lighting effect is literally just this light that will take and open or close as if you had a narrow or really wide light that you want to apply to anything across here. So the same way that you would a spotlight in normal, like think of it in that same context. Then I'm giving it a lighting color of just off white because that's fun. And then I need to tell the SVG where in the box, so imagine you have this 3D box and you have the SVG on this one space. I need to tell it where within the X, Y, and Z planes we actually want to put this light. So I can put it really high up, I can put it right in front of it, I can put it really low. And so you can take and like imagine this 3D dimensional box that you have and just take and apply that same filter effect to it. Then what happens is I need to take the original source graphic, then I need to take all of the effects that I had applied to this and I need to squash them together. Because otherwise you have this really blurred SVG, and by applying both of those together and creating these layers, it's the same way that you would take and apply layers within like Photoshop or Illustrator. You just take and pile it on top of one another. And so then I will take the original source graphic, I put it in, and then I take the result from the specular lighting effect, and I squish them together. There's an arithmetic equation that's applied to this. I'm also happy to talk about that a little bit later. But for now, we're going to open up this item so you guys can see it. So one of the things that I really like to do is remove this source graphic so that you guys can see what happens. So by removing the source graphic, you actually you have a much more distinct piece, but by adding it back in, you can see that there's like a more defined line on here, and so the lighting effect will actually take and apply it across the entire ecosystem. And then if you want to, you can take and decrease the specular exponent, and it'll actually widen the light for you. So as you increase the specular exponent, the more narrow the light gets, and the difference of the effect that you'll see. Let me see if I can, there we go. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the FE exponent piece. So that really big ass piece of code right there, that's defining the skull. It's massive. It's because of all of the points that are within the vector itself. In order to be able to squash this and just apply everything to a single SVG, that's the effect that comes from it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the source graphic. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the glow effect. So I don't know if you guys can see that. It is glowing right now. Essentially what happens in this particular SVG is, we'll just create this a little bit bigger. Okay, now you should be able to see it going in and out a little bit quicker. Okay, so this is, you guys can see that okay? So this is a pretty complex example. What happens if I take away this original source graphic is it just creates this like really blurry effect on it. So you can see why you would want to have the two layers merged together in order to create that actual effect. And so I'm just going to go through all of this code right now. So we have an ID called glow, where we're defining the actual filter that we want to apply to the SVG. Then we are calling that same URL within the SVG parent element. I am also applying a color fill with this like blue hex code. Okay. So the actual element that we're creating here is we're taking and applying that glow effect. We're applying a standard deviation of 50. So that 50 is just how far away, or like how much of a how much we're actually going to be blurring the element itself. And so the higher that you go, it's 0 to 100 that you can be using. The higher you go, the more blurry the image is going to be. We're taking that initial result. Sorry, I can't like see where my mouse is. There we go. So we're taking that initial result by applying that effect, and we're calling it spec 1. From there, I want to take and apply the animate element, and I want to animate the standard deviation. So I want the glow to create this pulsing effect. And so by targeting the standard deviation, I can tell it to go from 0 to 50, which is the standard deviation that we defined in the original parent Gaussian blur element. Then I'm going to give it a duration of 0.1 seconds. And I want to repeat the count indefinitely so that the glow starts to like create that pulse effect by going in and out. Now I'm going to be taking, the values of 0 to 50, 50 back to 0. So I want this to be a relatively smooth animation, and so I want it to go up and then come back down. So in the same way that you would take and define that within your CSS, you can take and define it within the element itself. Now we have the key times and the key splines. Now those respectively are related to the keyframes and the timing element that you want to be applying within the CSS. The key splines are the cubic Bezier function. So instead of having the cubic Bezier defined with 4 different numbers, you take and have it within the matrix itself. Also happy to explain that math to you a little bit later. And then from there, we want to take and squish all of these effects together with the FE composite element itself. And so you're going to take the original source graphic, you're going to take the result, which we had defined as spec 1, and you're going to merge them together. And from there, that's how you create these like awesome effects. But again, you want to be able to define that right at the beginning. And so That's kind of part of the discussion. So now we're going to move on to one of the other ones that I really like. And so this is that same point light that you're applying, but now I'm applying an actual animate element to it and taking and moving the light across the plane, the X plane, back and forth across the page. And so one of the things that you'll see within here is on the right-hand side, the light actually goes off of the canvas itself. So you're applying a negative value to that, whereas you want to be starting, if you want to be starting right at 0, you'll see that it hits the limits of the actual box. And so within here, I've defined the filter of the spotlight moving. I will open this. Hopefully it works. Okay, super. So again, we're taking and applying the effect. We're giving it an ID. Now, what's happening in here is we're applying a blur effect to the original source graphic itself. We're calling that result by applying a standard deviation of 2, blur 1. From there, we are taking that end result and we're putting it into the next filter that we want to be creating. And we're calling the result of that spec 1. From there, I'm taking and adding a specular exponent. So remember in that first example that we had with the light, where we had a really high or really low value of the light. And so within this particular SVG, the light source is actually really narrow. And I'm applying a lighting color of just off white. Okay. I'll wrap it up real quick. Then from there, I'm taking and defining where within this cube I actually want this light source to be living. Okay? From there, I want to animate the point light itself. So I want it to be going across the X plane. Then from all of that, I'm going to take and merge everything together into one SVG. And so this particular effect, it takes the original source graphic and it takes the results of the other 3 effects that we had applied and it merges it all into one. Does that make sense? Super. Okay. So let's talk about browser support. The fun part, you know? i.e. crushing all of our souls. So there is this lovely lady called Sarah Drasner. She says that SMIL is dead. So SMIL is the FE Ghost on Blur, the FE Composite, the inline elements that you can utilize right now. It still works in the browser. It still works across Chrome. If you go to Can I Use, it has pretty good support. Okay? However, and like a lot of the effects that I had showed you before, they also have really good support. But if you want to be using this across browsers, there's a library called GSAP or GreenSock that you can utilize. And you can take and apply those exact same effects using their library. And it'll add a polyfill and you can utilize it across multiple browsers. It is using JavaScript, so you wouldn't actually be using this with the inline SVG elements that I was showing you earlier. But again, like all of that's up on the CodePen, so if you guys want to play around with it, like you're more than welcome to. Oh, for those of you that code in Ruby, because I code in Ruby, I found this Ruby helper a few years ago, and I thought it was just epic. And you can just take and call whatever the original SVG element it is. And that's it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Do we have time for questions? Questions? Like 5 minutes? We got 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions, you guys can grill me. Yeah. Right? So his question was, is it better to have the component rendered over and over and over again, or is it better within like the React, or is it better to have it defined once and just utilize the use element? And so in that case that you're talking about, I usually will put that component within the footer because the footer is never going to disappear. And so from there, I can take and call the use element across the entire ecosystem of my React application, and the icons will render the same. Does that answer your question? kind of, sort of. We can talk more about it after if you want. Do I have any other questions? No? Super. See you guys later. Thank you.